I'm Edward, and I appreciate you being part of our cozy community. Tonight, a special greeting to Miami. Tell us where you're listening from, and which part of your life brings you the warmest memories. Don't forget to subscribe for new stories daily. Now get comfortable and enjoy the mystery. Chapter 1. The House That Ran on Habit. There are certain houses in the English countryside that seem to exist outside the ordinary passage of time, where the clocks tick with measured certainty and the seasonal rhythms are observed with a constancy that might be called either comforting or oppressive, depending upon one's perspective. Ashley Court was such a house, standing just beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead in a modest park of its own, neither grand enough to be called a great estate, nor humble enough to be dismissed as merely substantial. It was in every respect exactly what it appeared to be, the residence of a gentleman of comfortable means who valued tradition above innovation and order above convenience. Sir Reginald Ashley, its owner and master, was himself a man who might have been designed to suit his surroundings. In his late 60s, with thinning grey hair brushed carefully across a high forehead and a military bearing that suggested service in some regiment of no particular distinction, he carried himself with the quiet authority of one who has never seriously questioned his own judgment. He had been knighted for services to local government, something to do with municipal planning and the preservation of rural character, and wore his title with the same unassuming dignity with which he wore his well-tailored but never ostentatious suits. His household reflected his principles. There was Mrs. Ashley, his wife of 40 years, a tall, rather angular woman with faded blonde hair, and the kind of gracious manner that suggested she had been taught long ago that pleasant conversation was a duty to be performed rather than a pleasure to be enjoyed. There was their daughter, Miss Caroline Ashley, who at 35 had the slightly disappointed air of a woman who had expected life to present certain opportunities which had somehow failed to materialize. And there was the usual complement of servants, a cook, 2 housemaids, a gardener who came daily, and of course Mr. Wilfred Grant, the butler. It was Mr. Grant who truly embodied the continuity of Ashley Court. He had entered service there nearly 40 years ago, arriving as a young man of 25 with excellent references and a quiet manner that had suited Sir Reginald's father, the previous baronet, and had suited Sir Reginald himself when he inherited both house and staff. Mr. Grant was now approaching his mid-60s, a tall, spare man with silver hair brushed straight back from a high, pale forehead and the kind of face that seemed designed to express nothing whatsoever. His movements were precise, his voice modulated to perfect neutrality, and his presence in any room was so unobtrusive that one might almost fail to notice he was there at all. Miss Marple had been aware of Mr. Grant for many years, in the way that one is aware of permanent fixtures in the landscape of village life. She had seen him at St. Mary Mead on his rare afternoons off, walking with measured steps to the post office or the chemist, always correctly dressed in a dark suit and carrying himself with the same dignity he maintained at Ashley Court. They had never exchanged more than a courteous greeting, but Miss Marple, who made it her business to observe people rather more closely than they generally realized, had long since formed certain impressions about Mr. Grant. He was, she thought, a man who had learned to make himself invisible, not from any lack of character or intelligence, quite the contrary. There was something in his eyes, when one caught his glance, that suggested considerable understanding, and perhaps even a sense of humour that had been carefully suppressed. But he had chosen, or perhaps been obliged by circumstances, to live his life in the service of others, and had done so with such complete dedication that his own personality had been gradually effaced, like the inscription on an old gravestone worn smooth by weather and time. It was on a bright afternoon in late April that Miss Marple had occasion to observe Mr. Grant more closely than usual. She had been invited to luncheon at Ashley Court, a modest affair, nothing elaborate, but Sir Reginald maintained certain social obligations, and Miss Marple, as a lady of good family and long residence in St. Mary Mead, was periodically included in such gatherings. The occasion was the visit of Sir Reginald's nephew, a Mr. Edward Latimer, who was making a brief stop in the neighbourhood before continuing on to London. The luncheon party consisted of Miss Marple herself, Mr. and Mrs. Ashley, Miss Caroline, Mr. Latimer, pleasant young man of about 30 with an easy manner and a career in banking, and a Mrs. Blackwood from the neighbouring village, a widow of uncertain age who devoted herself to charitable works and rarely declined an invitation to luncheon. They gathered in the drawing-room before the meal was announced, and Miss Marple, seated near the window with a clear view of the room, watched as Mr. Grant moved among them with a silver tray of sherry. He paused before each guest with perfect timing, his expression polite and completely neutral, offering the tray with a slight inclination of his head. Sir Reginald took a glass without looking at him. Mrs. Ashley murmured something that might have been thanks, but was directed more toward the air than toward the butler. Miss Caroline selected her glass with the kind of automatic gesture one might use to pluck a flower from a convenient vase. Only Mr. Latimer, who, perhaps less accustomed to the rituals of such households, actually met Mr. Grant's eyes and said, "Thank you, very kind." Mr. Grant's expression did not change in the slightest, but Miss Marple, watching closely, thought she detected the faintest flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or possibly gratitude, before the mask of professional neutrality descended once more. When luncheon was announced, they proceeded to the dining room, a handsome chamber with panelled walls and tall windows overlooking the gardens. The meal was well prepared and correctly served, each course appearing and disappearing with the smooth efficiency that characterised all aspects of life at Ashley Court. Mr. Giselde Grant stood near the sideboard, directing the movements of the younger maid who assisted him, his hands moving in small, precise gestures that required no explanation, because they had been repeated so many thousands of times that they had become a kind of silent language. The conversation at table was pleasant and undemanding. Mr. Latimer spoke of his work in London, though in terms vague enough to avoid any suggestion of professional impropriety. Mrs. Blackwood described the progress of the spring fete that was being organised for the benefit of the church roof. Sir Reginald offered his opinions on several matters of local concern, speaking with the measured authority of one accustomed to being heeded. Miss Marple contributed the occasional observation and listened with the attentive courtesy that had, over many years, allowed her to learn far more than most people realised. Throughout the meal, Mr. Grant moved silently through the room, replenishing water glasses and removing plates, his presence so thoroughly assimilated into the fabric of the household that no one acknowledged it. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether this invisibility was a source of satisfaction or pain to him. There were people, she knew, who took genuine pride in performing their duties with such perfection that they seemed to disappear into the service itself. But there were also people who became invisible because they had learned that visibility invited attention they could not afford, questions they preferred not to answer, or scrutiny that might reveal things better left unexamined. As coffee was served in the drawing-room, Miss Marple happened to glance through the doorway into the dining-room and saw Mr. Grant standing perfectly still beside the sideboard, his face turned slightly away from the company. For just a moment, when he thought himself unobserved, his shoulders sagged very slightly, and his hand moved to his chest in a gesture that suggested discomfort, or perhaps weariness. Then, as if recollecting himself, he straightened once more and resumed his duties. Miss Marple said nothing, but she made a mental note. She had seen that gesture before in her long experience of village life. The momentary dropping of a carefully maintained facade, the brief acknowledgement of some burden or distress that could not be openly admitted. It meant something, though what exactly she could not yet say. The luncheon concluded with the usual courtesies, and Miss Marple made her way home to her cottage, walking slowly through the pleasant spring afternoon, and turning over in her mind the small observations she had collected. Ashley Court had seemed, as always, a model of order and respectability. Reginald had been his usual self, courteous and rather pompous. Mrs. Ashley had performed her duties as hostess with practised efficiency. Miss Caroline had been polite but somewhat distracted, and Mr. Latimer had provided the easy conversation of a young man comfortable in any social setting. And Mr. Grant had served the luncheon with his customary perfection, moving through the rooms like a shadow, noticed by no one except Miss Marple herself. Later that week, the news reached St. Mary Mead that Mr. Grant had died. He had been found in his room at Ashley Court, seated in his chair, dressed in his evening clothes as if prepared to go down to dinner. The doctor had been called, but there was nothing to be done. It was his heart, Sir Reginald explained to those who inquired. He had been failing for some time, though he had continued his duties with characteristic dedication until the very end. "A good man," Sir Reginald said, with the kind of measured regret one might express for the loss of a valued possession. "Loyal, discreet, never any trouble. We shall miss him greatly." Miss Marple, hearing this in the village shop, offered her condolences and expressed her sympathy. But privately, as she walked home with her basket, she found herself thinking about that moment in the dining room, when Mr. Grant had stood alone and unseen, his hand pressed briefly to his chest. And she wondered, with the particular quality of attention she brought to such matters, whether anyone at Ashley Court had actually noticed that Mr. Grant was failing, or whether perhaps he had simply been failing to be noticed. The question, she thought, was worth considering. And Miss Marple, when she found a question worth considering, was seldom content to let it rest unanswered. Chapter 2. A tray left outside the study. The funeral took place on a grey Thursday morning, conducted with the same restrained dignity that had characterised Mr. Grant's entire tenure at Ashley Court. The service was held at St. Mary Mead's Parish Church, a modest gathering that included the Ashley family, the household staff, and a scattering of villagers who attended less from personal acquaintance with the deceased than from a sense of what was proper. Mr. Grant, after all, had been a familiar figure in the village for nearly 40 years, and his passing marked the end of an era in that quiet, unobtrusive way that such endings often do. Miss Marple attended naturally and observed the proceedings with her customary attentiveness. Sir Reginald delivered a brief eulogy that praised Mr. Grant's loyalty, discretion, and dedication to duty. Words that were perfectly correct and entirely sincere, yet somehow managed to convey more about the speaker's sense of decorum than about the man being mourned. Mrs. Ashley sat with appropriate solemnity, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Miss Caroline's expression suggested she was thinking about something else entirely, though she maintained the proper attitude of respectful attention. The servants occupied the pews at the back. Mrs. Pemberton, the cook, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from genuine grief or simply from the emotion appropriate to such occasions, it was difficult to say. The two housemaids, young women in their 20s named Alice and Dorothy, looked subdued and rather uncertain, as if unsure what degree of feeling they were permitted to display. The gardener, Mr. Hodges, stood at the very back with his cap in his hands, his weathered face expressing nothing in particular. After the service there was a brief gathering at Ashley Court, tea and sandwiches in the morning room, served with the same efficiency the household had always maintained, though now without the guiding presence that had ensured such perfection for so many years. Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea from Alice, who managed the task with creditable composure if not quite the seamless grace Mr. Grant would have displayed, found herself in conversation with Mrs. Pemberton. The cook was a stout woman of 50-odd years who had been at Ashley Court for nearly 2 decades, though she had never achieved the same degree of indispensability as Mr. Grant. She had a round, pleasant face that tended toward anxiety when circumstances deviated from routine, and just now she wore an expression of genuine distress, overlaid with the practical concern of someone responsible for maintaining household functions during a period of disruption. "It's the suddenness of it, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice, though they stood somewhat apart from the main group. "One day he was here, going about his duties same as always, and the next morning, well, it doesn't bear thinking about, does it? Finding him like that, I mean, all dressed for dinner and sitting in his chair as if he'd just settled down for a moment's rest." "It must have been very distressing for whoever discovered him," Miss Marple said gently. "Was it one of the maids?" "Dorothy, yes. She went to call him for breakfast, which was unusual in itself. Mr. Grant was always up before anyone else, you see, making sure everything was ready. When he didn't come down, Dorothy thought perhaps he was unwell and went to knock at his door. When there was no answer, she became worried and fetched me. We went in together, and there he was." Mrs. Pemberton's voice dropped still lower. The doctor said it would have been very quick. A mercy, really, though it doesn't feel like one just now." Miss Marple murmured something sympathetic and allowed a small silence to develop, the kind of pause that often encouraged people to continue speaking when they had more to say. Mrs. Pemberton did not disappoint. "The odd thing was," she said, after glancing around to ensure they would not be overheard, "the tray." "The tray?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone suggesting nothing more than polite interest. "Yes, the supper tray. You see, Mr. Grant always prepared a light supper for Sir Reginald when he worked late in his study. Cold meat, cheese, a bit of bread, that sort of thing. It was part of the routine, had been for years. That last evening, Mr. Grant prepared the tray just as he always did. But when Alice went to collect it the next morning, it was still sitting outside the study door, completely untouched." "Perhaps Sir Reginald wasn't hungry," Miss Marple suggested. "That's just it. He was in his study all evening, working on some papers or other. He would have seen the tray, surely. But Alice said when she asked him about it, very respectfully of course, just wanting to know if there was something wrong with the food, he seemed surprised, almost as if he'd forgotten it had been left there at all. He said—" Mrs. Pemberton paused, choosing her words carefully. "He said Mr. Grant had been told to leave it and not to disturb him again that evening." Miss Marple's eyes behind her mild expression sharpened, very slightly. "To leave it." "Yes, that's what Alice told me," Sir Reginald said, "that Mr. Grant had left the tray as instructed and was not to come back, which seemed strange because it wasn't Mr. Grant's way to leave things halfway done, if you understand me. He would have waited to see if anything else was needed, or at least have made sure the tray was properly placed, and not just set down in the corridor where anyone might trip over it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "he wasn't feeling quite well and wished to retire early." Mrs. Pemberton nodded slowly. "That's what we all thought afterward, that he must have been feeling poorly, and that's why he didn't follow his usual routine. But at the time, Miss Marple, I remember thinking it was odd, and there's something else." She hesitated, then continued in an even lower voice. "Alice said that when she was collecting the tray the next morning, she could hear Sir Reginald moving about in his study, and he sounded, well, irritated. She heard him say something about people forgetting their place, or words to that effect. She didn't catch it all, and of course she wouldn't have been listening deliberately, but it gave her the impression that Sir Reginald had been annoyed about something the evening before." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the appearance of someone merely engaged in pleasant post-funeral conversation. "How very distressing for everyone concerned," she said. "These disruptions of routine are always unsettling, particularly in a household that runs as smoothly as Ashley Court has always done." "Indeed, Miss Marple, and now we're all at 6s and 7s, trying to manage without Mr. Grant. Sir Reginald has spoken about engaging a new butler, but it won't be the same. It can't be, can it? Not after 40 years. They were interrupted by Miss Caroline, who approached with the vague purpose of ensuring that guests were being properly attended to. Mrs. Pemberton excused herself and returned to her duties, leaving Miss Marple to accept another cup of tea and to stand quietly near the window, watching the subdued gathering and thinking about the untouched tray. It was a small thing, perhaps, the kind of domestic detail that would ordinarily pass without notice. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that small things, particularly small departures from established patterns, often signified something more substantial than they appeared. A man who had performed his duties with unfailing precision for 40 years did not suddenly become careless about such matters without reason. The word that stayed with her was leave. Such an ordinary word used constantly in daily speech without particular significance, but in this context it seemed to carry weight. Mr. Grant had been told to leave the tray, to leave it and not return, to leave Sir Reginald undisturbed for the remainder of the evening. In a household where the butler's presence was both constant and invisible, where his movements were anticipated and his services taken for granted, such an instruction suggested something unusual. Either Sir Reginald had been engaged in business too private to allow even the discreet presence of his butler, or there had been some other reason to require solitude. And Mr. Grant, who surely must have been aware after 40 years of service, when his employer preferred to be left alone, had needed to be told explicitly, unless of course the instruction had been given not as information but as dismissal. Miss Marple finished her tea and set down the cup with thoughtful precision. She circulated briefly among the other guests, offering appropriate condolences and receiving the kind of conventional responses such occasions demanded. But her mind remained occupied with the image of that tray sitting untouched outside the study door, and with the question of why a man who prided himself on perfect service had chosen, on his last evening, to leave something incomplete. Or perhaps, she reflected, he had not chosen at all. Perhaps he had simply been told to leave, and had done so because that was what 40 years of service had taught him to do. Later, as she walked home through the village, Miss Marple considered the word from another angle. In households of a certain type, leave was the polite euphemism for many things. Leave it. Leave us. Leave me alone. Leave before you become inconvenient. The word could be spoken kindly, but it remained, at its heart, a form of dismissal. She thought of Mr. Grant standing in the corridor with his carefully prepared tray, being told to leave it there and not return. She thought of him going back to his room, perhaps with that same hand pressed briefly to his chest, perhaps with the sole knowledge that something had shifted in the careful architecture of his life. And she thought, as she had thought before, that people who became invisible often learned to accept being forgotten, until, of course, they were not there at all, and others were left to wonder when, precisely, they had stopped noticing. It was, Miss Marple decided, a question worth pursuing, not with urgency or drama. Such things were quite out of place in a matter of this nature, but with the patient attentiveness that had served her well in the past, when small domestic details had proven to be the threads that, when gently pulled, revealed patterns others had preferred to leave unexamined. She let herself into her cottage, removed her hat and gloves, and sat down in her favourite chair with her knitting. But her needles moved more slowly than usual, and her gaze rested on the middle distance, seeing not her quiet sitting room but a tray left outside a study door, and a man who'd been told, with perfect courtesy, to leave. Chapter 3. Voices lowered in the hall. In the days following the funeral, life at Ashley Court resumed its customary patterns with the determined efficiency of an institution that has learned to absorb disruption without acknowledging it too openly. The morning routine continued. Meals appeared at their appointed hours, and the rooms maintained their air of quiet order. Yet something had altered in the atmosphere of the house, something that Miss Marple, who called again the following week to return a book Mrs. Ashley had lent her, noticed immediately upon entering the hall. It was in the quality of the silence, she thought, not the comfortable quiet of a well-regulated household, but rather the careful hush of people choosing their words with unusual deliberation. Alice admitted her, taking her coat with a nervous efficiency that suggested the young woman was still adjusting to performing duties without the steadying presence of Mr. Grant's oversight. The maid's movements were correct but hesitant, as if she were conscious of being observed and judged by standards that had not yet been clearly articulated. "Mrs. Ashley is in the morning room, Miss Marple," Alice said, her voice pitched lower than necessary for the empty hall. "If you'll follow me, please." As they proceeded down the corridor, Miss Marple became aware of voices from the direction of the servants' hall, not loud, but with that particular intensity that comes from restrained emotion rather than volume. The words were indistinct, but the tone carried a note of something that might have been concern or possibly disagreement. Alice's step quickened slightly, and she glanced back with an expression that suggested she hoped Miss Marple had not noticed. Mrs. Ashley received her with the gracious warmth of a hostess who is genuinely pleased to have a visitor, but perhaps also grateful for the distraction from less pleasant considerations. She was seated near the window with some embroidery in her lap, though the work appeared to have been more contemplated than executed. "My dear Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. Do sit down. I shall ring for tea." She reached for the bell, then paused with an expression of momentary confusion. "That is, Alice, would you ask Mrs. Pemberton to bring tea, please? For 2. Alice bobbed a curtsy and withdrew, and Mrs. Ashley turned back to Miss Marple with a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. One must adjust to new arrangements. It's remarkable how much one relied upon certain routines without quite realizing it. Change is always unsettling, Miss Marple agreed, settling herself in the chair opposite. Even necessary changes take time to accommodate. Yes, precisely. Mrs. Ashley set aside her embroidery with evident relief. Sir Reginald has been interviewing candidates for Mr. Grant's position, but it's proving rather difficult. He had very particular requirements, you understand. Not everyone is suited to the role. Miss Marple murmured something appropriately sympathetic and waited, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Experience had taught her that people who wished to speak of troubling matters often required nothing more than patient silence and an attentive audience. Mrs. Ashley glanced toward the door, as if ensuring it was properly closed, before continuing in a lower voice. The truth is, Miss Marple, we none of us quite realized how much Mr. Grant managed. Not simply the visible duties, but all the small matters that kept the household running smoothly. Sir Reginald has been obliged to deal with tradesmen directly, and Cook has questions about the accounts, and Caroline has been quite overwhelmed trying to coordinate everything. Mr. Grant never seemed to do very much, and yet somehow everything was always done. He was clearly very competent, Miss Marple observed. Oh yes, most competent, and so very loyal. Mrs. Ashley's expression grew thoughtful. That was what Sir Reginald said at the funeral, was it not? Loyal and discreet. One could rely upon Mr. Grant absolutely. He was never any trouble. There was something in the way she pronounced those last words that caught Miss Marple's attention. Not emphasis exactly, but a certain quality of repetition, as if the phrase had been spoken often enough to become a kind of formula. That must have been a great comfort, Miss Marple said, particularly in a position that requires such trust. Indeed. There were matters, family matters, you understand, that required discretion, and Mr. Grant was always most tactful. He had been with us through various difficulties, and one knew he would never speak of things that were better kept private. Mrs. Ashley paused, seeming to reconsider what she had been about to say. Not that there was anything improper, you understand, simply the ordinary trials that every family experiences from time to time. Miss Marple nodded with perfect understanding, though she noted the qualification with interest. In her experience, assurances that nothing was improper often preceded explanations of why certain improprieties had been, in fact, quite reasonable under the circumstances. The tea arrived, brought by Mrs. Pemberton herself rather than one of the maids, which was itself a departure from custom. The cook set down the tray with careful precision and hovered for a moment as if uncertain whether she was expected to withdraw immediately or wait for further instructions. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton," Mrs. Ashley said. "That will be all." But the cook remained a moment longer, her hands twisting slightly in her apron. "If I might ask, ma'am, about the wine merchant's account. Mr. Grant always managed it directly with Sir Reginald, and now Mr. Baxter is asking about payment, and I wasn't certain what I should tell him." A flicker of irritation crossed Mrs. Ashley's face, quickly suppressed. "You must speak to Sir Reginald about such matters. I'm sure he will attend to it." "Yes, ma'am. It's only that Mr. Baxter seemed to think there might be some confusion about the recent orders, and I didn't want— that is, I thought it better to mention it." "I'm certain there is no confusion," Mrs. Ashley said, with a firmness that ended the discussion. "Sir Reginald will address it when he has time." Mrs. Pemberton withdrew, and Mrs. Ashley poured the tea with hands that were not quite steady. "Everything is in such disorder," she said, more to herself than to Miss Marple. "One would have thought Mr. Grant might have left better notes about these arrangements, but perhaps he expected to be here longer." "He died very suddenly, I understand," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes, very suddenly. Though Sir Reginald tells me he had been unwell for some time, he simply never mentioned it, which was quite typical of his discretion. One wouldn't wish to burden others with personal difficulties." Mrs. Ashley sipped her tea, then set down the cup with a small decisive movement. "Sir Reginald feels rather badly about it, I think." He had spoken to Mr. Grant about possibly retiring. It was meant kindly, you understand. Mr. Grant was approaching 65, and one thought he might prefer to take things easier in his remaining years. But perhaps it was not received quite as it was intended. "That must be distressing for Sir Reginald," Miss Marple said. "He meant it for the best. We all did." And Mr. Grant assured him he quite understood. He was very correct about it, very proper. There was no unpleasantness at all. Mrs. Ashley's voice had taken on a slightly defensive quality. We had thought to help him find a suitable cottage somewhere, perhaps with a small pension. It was all to be managed very generously. Miss Marple made a small sound of acknowledgement and accepted a biscuit from the plate Mrs. Ashley had offered. The conversation moved to other topics, the progress of spring in the gardens, the latest news from the parish, the health of various mutual acquaintances, but Miss Marple's mind remained partly occupied with what had been said, and perhaps more significantly, with what had been carefully left unsaid. When she took her leave some time later, she encountered Miss Caroline in the hall. Sir Reginald's daughter was dressed for going out, pulling on her gloves with quick, impatient movements that suggested she was eager to be away from the house. "Miss Marple, good afternoon. I hope Mother hasn't kept you too long with her worries. She's been quite agitated about household matters lately, though I keep telling her they'll sort themselves out." "It's natural to feel unsettled after such a loss," Miss Marple said. Miss Caroline made a small dismissive gesture. "I suppose, though really one would think we'd lost a member of the family rather than a servant, the way everyone is carrying on. I don't mean to sound callous, but Mr. Grant was employed, here. That was the arrangement. It's not as though he wasn't paid or that we somehow owed him more than the wages he received." There was a sharpness in her tone that surprised Miss Marple, coming as it did from someone who had seemed merely distracted at the funeral. Miss Caroline appeared to realise she had spoken too forcefully and softened her expression. "I only mean that Father is making himself quite miserable about it, talking about how loyal Mr. Grant was, how he should have noticed he was unwell, all of that sort of thing. But Mr. Grant never said anything, did he? If he was ill, he should have spoken up. One can't be expected to read minds." "That's quite true," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Though some people are reluctant to acknowledge their own difficulties, particularly when they fear it might make them seem less capable." Miss Caroline pulled on her second glove with a sharp tug. "Well, it was foolish of him, and now we're all left to manage the consequences." She seemed to catch herself again. "I don't mean to be unkind. It's very sad, of course. But life must continue, mustn't it?" She swept out with a brief nod, leaving Miss Marple standing in the hall with Alice, who had materialised to show her out. The young maid's face was carefully expressionless, but Miss Marple detected a tightness around her mouth that suggested she had heard Miss Caroline's remarks and had opinions about them that would not be voiced. As Miss Marple walked home through the mild spring afternoon, she reflected on the conversation she had heard. Everyone spoke of Mr. Grant with praise, loyal, discreet, never any trouble. Yet beneath the conventional words, she sensed something else. Not guilt precisely, though that might be part of it. Rather, it was the careful quality of people who were reassuring themselves that they had behaved correctly, that nothing improper had occurred, that if there was any sense of unease, it was entirely unwarranted. People who needed to insist repeatedly that someone had never been any trouble were often people who had found that person troublesome in ways they preferred not to examine, and people who praised loyalty and discretion so consistently were sometimes people who had required those qualities to prevent uncomfortable truths from emerging. Miss Marple had noticed over many years of observing human nature that the praise bestowed upon the recently deceased often told one more about the living than about the dead, and in this case the praise for Mr. Grant, so uniform, so carefully worded, suggested that those who spoke it were less concerned with honouring his memory than with ensuring that certain matters remained as discreetly buried as Mr. Grant himself. She let herself into her cottage and went to put the kettle on, her mind still occupied with voices lowered in careful conversation, and with all the things that had been said so very correctly, while meaning something rather different beneath the surface. Chapter 4, The Politeness That Replaced Concern. Miss Marple encountered Sir Reginald quite by chance some 10 days after the funeral, though chance in village life often has a way of being less accidental than it appears. She had been walking past the post office when he emerged, a sheaf of the correspondence in one hand and an expression of mild vexation on his distinguished features. Upon seeing Miss Marple, his expression shifted to one of courteous recognition, and he raised his hat with the automatic grace of long-established habit. "Miss Marple, good morning. Pleasant day, is it not?" "Very pleasant indeed, Sir Reginald. I hope you are well." "As well as can be expected. Thank you. Still adjusting to new circumstances, as I'm sure you can imagine. These matters take time." He hesitated, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "I wonder if I might walk with you a little way. I should value your opinion on a matter that has been troubling me somewhat." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously, and they fell into step together, walking slowly in the direction of the village green. Sir Reginald was silent for a few moments, ordering his thoughts in the methodical way that characterised his approach to most things. "You were kind enough to attend Grant's funeral," he said at length, "and I believe my wife mentioned that you called at the house recently. She found your visit most comforting. These have been difficult days for her, I'm afraid. The disruption of routine affects her more than she cares to admit." "Mrs. Ashley has always valued order and continuity," Miss Marple observed. "Such qualities are admirable, though perhaps they make one rather vulnerable when circumstances require adjustment." Quite so, Sir Reginald cleared his throat. "The truth is, Miss Marple, I find myself in a somewhat uncomfortable position. There have been, well, not criticisms precisely, but certain implications in the village that I had somehow failed in my duty toward Grant, that I had been, in some way, neglectful of a man who had served my family faithfully for so many years." He spoke with the careful dignity of one who is accustomed to deference and finds public questioning of his conduct both surprising and distasteful. Miss Marple said nothing, allowing him to continue. "I should like to set the record straight if I may. Grant's death was a tragedy, certainly, and I regret it deeply, but I had taken every proper step to ensure his welfare. I had, in fact, broached the subject of retirement with him several weeks before his passing. It was done with the utmost sensitivity, I assure you." "I'm certain it was," Miss Marple said gently. Sir Reginald seemed encouraged by this. "I had noticed, or rather, I had begun to notice that Grant was not quite himself. Small things, you understand, a tendency to forget instructions or to seem somewhat overwrought when matters were perfectly routine, nothing dramatic, but enough to give one concern. At his age, and with his years of service, it seemed only right to suggest that he might wish to consider taking things easier." "That sounds very considerate," Miss Marple said. "I thought I composed a letter, or nothing harsh, nothing that could be construed as criticism. I was careful to emphasize his years of loyal service and to make it clear that this was suggested in his own interests, for his health and well-being. I even mentioned that we would, of course, provide appropriate references should he wish to seek lighter duties elsewhere, though naturally we hoped he would remain in the neighbourhood where we might continue to see him from time to time." They had reached a bench near the green, and Sir Reginald gestured toward it with a question in his expression. Miss Marple nodded, and they sat down together in the dappled shade of an old oak tree. Sir Reginald continued, his voice taking on a slightly defensive note. "Grant's response was perfectly correct. He thanked me for my concern, assured me he understood completely, and said he would give the matter careful thought. There was no unpleasantness, no suggestion that he was offended. He continued his duties just as he always had, and yet—" Sir Reginald paused, his fingers tapping restlessly against the head of his walking stick. "And yet I cannot help feeling that perhaps I was misunderstood." "In what way?" Miss Marple asked. "I'm not entirely certain. It's more a matter of atmosphere than anything specific. But looking back, I wonder if Grant took my suggestion as something more than a suggestion. If he perhaps felt— Sir Reginald struggled visibly with the phrasing. If he felt that his position was no longer secure, that he was being, as it were, pushed out, which was never my intention, I assure you. The decision was to be entirely his own. Miss Marple considered this carefully before responding. It must be very difficult, she said, to receive such a letter from one's employer. Even when kindly worded, there is an inherent imbalance in the situation. Mr. Grant may have understood your intentions perfectly well, yet still found himself in an uncomfortable position. But I meant it kindly, Sir Reginald protested. I was thinking of his welfare, not my own convenience. If he had wished to remain in service, we would naturally have accommodated him. The letter was simply meant to open a conversation, to allow him to make his own choice without feeling obligated to continue beyond his strength. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, for a man who had devoted 40 years to his position, the suggestion that he might wish to step aside, however kindly phrased, must have carried considerable weight, particularly if his health was indeed failing, which would make the prospect of finding alternative employment rather daunting. Sir Reginald looked uncomfortable. You sound as though you think I acted improperly. Not at all, Miss Marple assured him. I'm certain you acted with the best of intentions, but intention and effect are not always the same thing, particularly in situations where there is such disparity of position. Mr. Grant may have heard your kindness as something quite different from what you meant to convey. Sir Reginald was silent for a long moment, staring across the green with the troubled eyes. My wife suggested that perhaps I should have spoken to him in person rather than writing, but that seemed too informal somehow. A letter allowed him time to consider without feeling pressed for an immediate response, and it seemed more respectful of his dignity. I'm sure it seemed so, Miss Marple said. There was no criticism in her tone, merely observation, but Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably on the bench. The difficulty, he said slowly, is that one doesn't quite know how to manage these situations. Grant wasn't family, but neither was he simply an employee in the ordinary sense. He was part of the household, privy to family matters, present at both celebrations and difficulties. Yet ultimately the relationship was a professional one. One cannot treat servants as equals without creating impossible confusion about expectations and boundaries. That's quite true, Miss Marple agreed. And yet servants are people, with feelings and concerns and worries about their futures. The challenge lies in remembering both things simultaneously. Sir Reginald nodded heavily. I believe I failed in that regard. Not through any deliberate unkindness, you understand, but through, what would you call it? A failure of imagination, perhaps. I thought of what seemed appropriate from my perspective, without adequately considering how it might appear from his. This admission appeared to cost him something, and Miss Marple responded to it with gentle respect. It's very difficult to see situations from multiple perspectives, particularly when one is accustomed to a certain way of thinking. And in matters of household management, there are established customs that seem to provide clear guidance. One follows those customs and assumes one has acted correctly. Yes, precisely. Sir Reginald seized on this with evident relief. That's exactly what I did. I followed the established practice for such situations. I was kind but clear, generous but firm. Everything one is supposed to do when managing such delicate matters. And yet somehow, he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Miss Marple completed it for him, her voice quiet but distinct. And yet somehow, Mr. Grant died. The words hung in the air between them, not accusatory but undeniable. Sir Reginald turned to look at her, his expression a mixture of discomfort and something that might have been gratitude for her directness. You think the letter contributed to his death? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that kindness, delivered at the wrong moment, or in the wrong manner, may cease to feel like kindness to the person receiving it. And for someone whose entire identity had been built upon his role, the suggestion that this role was no longer needed, however tactfully expressed, might have been rather more devastating than you intended. Sir Reginald rose from the bench with an abrupt movement, then stood looking down at Miss Marple with troubled eyes. What should I have done differently? It was, Miss Marple reflected, both too late and too honest a question to be easily answered. She rose as well, adjusting her gloves with quiet precision. I suspect, she said, that what Mr. Grant needed was not a letter, however kindly worded, but rather a conversation that acknowledged his humanity as well as his service. The difficulty with written communication is that it allows no opportunity for response, no chance for mutual understanding to develop. It presents a decision as already made, requiring only acceptance. But I meant him to feel free to choose. I'm sure you did, Mr. Marple said. A freedom, when offered by those who hold all the power, can feel remarkably like obligation, particularly to someone who has spent 40 years understanding that his welfare depended upon your family's goodwill. Sir Reginald stood very still for a moment, absorbing this. Then he nodded slowly, his face expressing a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. I shall have to live with that knowledge, he said quietly, that I meant well and caused harm nonetheless. Miss Marple regarded him with compassion. Most harm in this world is caused by people who meant well, Sir Reginald. That doesn't absolve us of responsibility, but it does suggest we might all practice rather more careful attention to how our actions affect those with less power than ourselves. They parted with courteous farewells, and Miss Marple continued her walk home with slow, thoughtful steps. Sir Reginald's admission had been honest, she thought, and painful. He genuinely believed he was acting correctly, following the customs and conventions that govern such situations, and in a sense he had been correct. By the standards of his class and position, he had behaved with perfect propriety. But propriety, Miss Marple reflected, was not the same as kindness, and kindness without understanding was often merely another form of cruelty dressed in more acceptable garments. Chapter 5. What was always known but never said. The village library in St. Mary Mead occupied a small stone building near the church, its modest collection maintained by a rotating committee of volunteers who took their responsibilities with varying degrees of seriousness. Miss Marple served her turn once a fortnight, and it was during one of these sessions, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, that she found herself in conversation with Miss Elspeth Fortescue, a woman of indeterminate age who had lived in the village all her life and possessed that comprehensive knowledge of local history that comes from paying close attention over many decades. Miss Fortescue had come to return several volumes on gardening, and had stayed, as she often did, to browse the shelves and exchange pleasantries. She was a thin, upright woman with grey hair, pulled back in an unfashionable style, and intelligent eyes that missed very little. Her father had been a schoolmaster, and she herself had taught at the village school for many years before retiring to care for her elderly mother. I was sorry to hear about Mr. Grant, she said, running her fingers along a row of books without particular purpose, though I can't say I knew him well. He kept very much to himself on his days off, didn't he? One saw him about the village, but he never stopped to talk. Always courteous, mind you, but distant, reserved. He was a very private person, I believe, Miss Marple said, stamping the date in the books Miss Fortescue had selected. Yes, though he wasn't always so. Miss Fortescue paused, then continued with the air of someone who has been considering whether to say something and has decided it does no harm now. He came to St. Mary Mead as a young man, you know, before he went into service at Ashley Court. This was long before your time, of course, Miss Marple. You would have been a young woman yourself then, living in London, I believe. I didn't settle here permanently until after the war, Miss Marple confirmed, curious to see where this recollection might lead. Ah, well then, Mr. Grant, Wilfrid as he was called then, arrived in the late 1880s, if my memory serves. He had been employed as a clerk in a solicitor's office in the county town, but something had happened. I never knew quite what, and he came here rather suddenly, looking for a fresh start, I suppose. My father took an interest in him. Father was always interested in young people who showed promise, and Wilfrid Grant certainly did that. Well-educated, well-spoken, with excellent handwriting and a good head for figures. Father thought he might be encouraged to study for the law himself, perhaps even sit for the solicitor's examinations eventually. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she continued with her knitting, listening with the appearance of mild interest that often encouraged people to elaborate on their reminiscences. Father arranged for him to have access to certain books, Miss Fortescue continued, and Mr. Grant, young Wilfrid, as we thought of him then, seemed quite keen on the idea. He would spend his evenings reading in his lodgings, and Father said he had a quick mind and a capacity for applying himself. But then, she paused, selecting her words carefully. Then circumstances changed. Mr. Grant's elderly mother fell ill, and there were expenses, I believe, medical care and so forth. He needed steady employment with better wages than a clerk's position offered, and Sir Reginald's father, the old baronet, was looking for a butler. Mr. Grant applied and was accepted. That must have been a difficult decision for him, Miss Marple observed. One would think so, wouldn't one? But he seemed to accept it with perfect equanimity. He thanked my father very politely for his interest and said that circumstances had made other paths impractical. Father tried to suggest alternatives, perhaps a loan or some arrangement that would allow him to continue his studies while working, but Mr. Grant was quite firm. He said he had made his choice and preferred not to revisit it. Miss Fortescue moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Father was disappointed, I remember. He felt that Mr. Grant was selling himself short, giving up real prospects for what was ultimately a life of service to others. But Mr. never expressed regret, at least not openly. He simply settled into his position and remained there for 40 years. Perhaps he found satisfaction in his work, Miss Marple suggested. Perhaps. Or perhaps he learned not to think about alternatives. Miss Fortescue turned back from the window, her expression thoughtful. The odd thing is how rarely it was spoken of, even in the village. People knew, of course. These things are always known in a small place. But it was never mentioned in his hearing. I think people felt it would be indelicate to remind him of paths not taken, and Mr. Grant himself never referred to his earlier ambitions. It was as though that brief period before he entered service had simply been erased from his history. Sometimes, Miss Marple said gently, people find it easier to deny possibilities than to acknowledge them as losses. Yes, I suppose so. Miss Fortescue collected her books and prepared to leave. Though I've always wondered whether Mr. Grant's reserve, that quality of keeping himself separate even while serving others, wasn't perhaps a way of maintaining some private dignity. A reminder to himself that he had once been something other than a butler, even if no one else remembered it. After Miss Fortescue had departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in the quiet library, her knitting resting idle in her lap. The picture that was forming of Mr. Grant, grew more complex with each new piece of information. He had not always been the invisible, self-effacing butler of Ashley Court. He had once been young Wilfrid, a man with education and prospects, capable of thinking about a future that extended beyond the careful performance of domestic duties. And then circumstances, family obligations, financial necessity, the ordinary pressures that shaped so many lives, had redirected him into service. Not a tragedy, perhaps, in the conventional sense. Many people made such compromises, setting aside personal ambitions for practical necessities. But there was something in the way it had been handled, in the careful science that surrounded those early aspirations, that troubled her. 2 days later, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Pemberton at the greengrocer's. The cook was examining vegetables with the critical eye of a professional, and she looked up with evident pleasure when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, good morning. I wonder if I might ask you your advice about something?" She glanced around to ensure they would not be overheard, then continued in a lower voice. "It's about Mr. Grant's things. We've been clearing his room, Sir Reginald asked us to, as he's interviewing for a replacement and needs the accommodation ready. And we found some books that seem rather valuable. Legal texts mostly, and quite old. Alice suggested we might mention them to Mr. Grant's solicitor, if he had one, but none of us knows whether he had any family to claim his effects." "He had no family?" Miss Marple asked. "Not that anyone knows of. His mother died years ago. She lived in lodgings in the village for a time while she was ill, and Mr. Grant paid for her care from his wages. After she passed, there was no one else. He was quite alone in the world, poor man." Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. "The books are inscribed, you see, to Wilfrid Grant, with every encouragement for his future studies. They are signed by someone called J. Fortescue, with a date from nearly 40 years ago. I thought perhaps they should be returned to the family who gave them, since they seem rather personal." "That would be very thoughtful," Miss Marple said. "Miss Fortescue's father was a schoolmaster. I'm certain she would appreciate the gesture." "There's something else," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice dropping still further. "We found some papers, letters and such, that suggest Mr. Grant had been making inquiries about other positions. Not recently, you understand, but over the years. Letters to agencies, that sort of thing. Most of them were very old, going back 20 years or more, but there were some more recent ones as well, as if he had been thinking about leaving for quite some time but had never quite managed it." Miss Marple absorbed this information with quiet attention. "That's very interesting." "Is it wrong of me to mention it?" Mrs. Pemberton asked anxiously. Only it seemed so, somehow, as if he'd been trying to imagine a different life but had never felt able to pursue it. And now, of course, it's too late. "I don't think it's wrong at all," Miss Marple assured her. "Sometimes understanding the truth about someone's life is the kindest tribute we can pay them." When she returned home, Miss Marple made herself a pot of tea and settled into her chair with her knitting, but her mind was occupied with the emerging portrait of Wilfrid Grant, a man who had once had prospects and education, who had set aside those prospects for family obligations, and who had then spent 40 years in service to others while maintaining, through all that time, some private dream of alternatives. A man who had inquired about other positions but had never left, whether from loyalty or fear, or simply from the weight of accumulated years. And what struck Miss Marple most forcefully was how carefully this history had been managed, not through active deception, but through a kind of collective forgetting. People in the village had known about Mr. Grant's early aspirations. Miss Fortescue's testimony made that clear, but they had learned not to mention them. The knowledge existed, but it had been pushed aside, treated as irrelevant, something that no longer mattered after so many years of service. Yet if it truly hadn't mattered, Miss Marple reflected, why had it been so carefully avoided? Why had people felt the need to insist, both to themselves and to others, that Mr. Grant's education and abandoned prospects were of no significance? In her experience, things that were genuinely unimportant were easily forgotten. They required no collective silence, no careful avoidance. It was only the things that mattered deeply, the losses that couldn't be acknowledged, the compromises that reflected poorly on those who had benefited from them, that required such determined denial. Mr. Grant had given up his prospects to care for his mother, and then had remained in service for 40 years, his education and intelligence channeled into the perfect performance of duties that required neither. And all the while the village and the household had agreed not to notice this waste, not to acknowledge what had been sacrificed, because to do so would have been uncomfortable for everyone involved. It was, Miss Marple thought, a particular kind of cruelty, not the dramatic cruelty of active harm, but the quiet cruelty of deliberate blindness. And Mr. Grant had borne it with dignity and silence, maintaining his reserve because to do otherwise would have been to force people to see what they preferred not to acknowledge. She wondered whether Sir Reginald had known about those early ambitions, or whether he too had found it more comfortable to think of Mr. Grant as simply a butler, without history or unrealised potential. Either way, the effect had been the same, a man reduced to his function, his personhood carefully overlooked in favour of his usefulness. And now, of course, he was gone, and everyone could afford to admit, safely, that he had once been something more, because there was no longer any risk that such admission might require them to treat him differently. Chapter 6. A reference too carefully worded. It was Miss Caroline who brought the matter of the reference letter to Miss Marple's attention, though she did so inadvertently and in a manner that suggested she had not intended to discuss it at all. They met in the churchyard on a Sunday morning following services, when Miss Caroline had paused to place fresh flowers on her grandmother's grave, and Miss Marple had stopped to admire the late spring blooms that were beginning to appear throughout the grounds. "They are particularly fine this year," Miss Marple observed, gesturing toward a bank of primroses that bordered the path. "The mild winter seems to have suited them." Miss Caroline glanced at the flowers with the distracted air of someone whose mind is occupied elsewhere. "Yes, very pretty. Though I've never had much patience for gardening myself, so much effort for such fleeting results." She adjusted the vase she had placed on the grave, her movements sharp and precise. "I suppose one could say the same about most endeavours, couldn't one? A great deal of effort expended and very little to show for it in the end." There was an edge to her voice that caught Miss Marple's attention. Miss Caroline had always struck her as a woman who carried her disappointments with brittle determination, refusing to acknowledge them openly while allowing them to colour her view of everything around her. This morning she seemed particularly agitated. "Is something troubling you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Caroline straightened, brushing a few stray leaves from her skirt with unnecessary vigour. "It's nothing really. Just the aftermath of Mr. Grant's death continues to create complications. One would think matters would have been settled by now, but there always seems to be something else requiring attention." She paused, then continued with the air of someone who has decided that speaking of a thing might relieve its pressure. "We found a letter among his effects, a reference he had requested from Father some months ago. It was tucked away in a drawer with other papers, apparently never sent." "A reference for what purpose?" Miss Marple inquired. "For another position, naturally. What else would he need a reference for?" Miss Caroline's tone carried a note of irritation. He had been applying to an agency that places experienced household staff in temporary situations, filling in when regular staff are ill or on holiday, that sort of thing. Nothing grand, just modest posts in respectable homes. The agency had requested a current reference from Father. And Sir Reginald provided one. Oh yes, Father provided one. He composed it very carefully, I'm sure, with all the proper forms of address and appropriate language. But she hesitated, seeming to reconsider whether she should continue. But Alice found it when she was clearing Mr. Grant's room, and naturally she brought it to Father, thinking there might be some question about why it hadn't been sent. Father was quite distressed about it. He'd forgotten he'd written it, you see, and now he's worrying that Mr. Grant had somehow been offended by its contents. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her attention sharpened. Was there something in the letter that might have given offence? Miss Caroline made a small dismissive gesture. Not that I could see, but then I'm not as sensitive as some people seem to think necessary. Father wrote that Mr. Grant had served our household for nearly 40 years with loyalty and discretion, that he was punctual and correct in his duties, and that he could be relied upon to perform routine tasks adequately. It seemed perfectly appropriate to me. There was something in the phrasing that struck Miss Marple as significant. He said adequately. Yes, or perhaps it was satisfactorily, something to that effect. I don't remember the exact wording. Miss Caroline's impatience was evident. The point is, Father was being truthful. Mr. Grant was adequate. He performed his duties correctly. He was reliable in routine matters. What more was Father supposed to say? What indeed, Miss Marple murmured. Now Father is convinced he somehow slighted Mr. Grant, that the letter was insufficiently warm or enthusiastic, and that Mr. Grant chose not to send it because he felt it would damn him with faint praise. I think it's all nonsense, frankly. If Mr. Grant wanted a more glowing reference, he should have performed more glowing service. One can't expect to be praised for mere competence. Miss Marple considered this for a moment before responding. It's interesting, though, isn't it? After 40 years of service, to characterize someone as merely adequate and reliable in routine tasks. One might have expected some mention of exceptional qualities or particular strengths. Miss Caroline's expression tightened. Mr. Grant was a butler, Miss Marple. His job was to be adequate and routine. That's what butlers do. They maintain order and perform established duties. He wasn't expected to be exceptional, and I don't believe he was. He was simply there, doing what was required of him year after year. That's hardly the stuff of glowing testimonials. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, 40 years of such governess must have required considerable dedication, and I believe your father mentioned at the funeral that Mr. Grant was privy to family matters and could be trusted with confidences. That suggests qualities beyond mere routine competence. For a moment, Miss Caroline seemed about to make a sharp retort, but she caught herself. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost grudging in its honesty. You're quite right, of course, father did say that, and it was true. Mr. Grant knew things about our family, about difficulties we had faced, about various matters that required discretion. He never spoke of them, never used them to his advantage. That did require exceptional qualities, I suppose. Then why, Miss Marple asked very gently, were those qualities not mentioned in the reference? Miss Caroline was silent for a long moment, staring down at her grandmother's grave. I don't know, she said finally. I suppose father didn't think it appropriate to mention such things in a formal reference, or perhaps, she stopped, seeming to consider something for the first time. Perhaps he didn't want to emphasize Mr. Grant's knowledge of family matters because that might raise questions about what exactly he knew. That's very perceptive, Miss Marple observed. Is it? Miss Caroline looked up, her expression troubled. It makes father sound rather calculating, doesn't it? As if he were more concerned with protecting his own privacy than with helping Mr. Grant find another position. But I'm sure that's not. That is, father would never deliberately, she trailed off, unable to complete either thought convincingly. I'm certain, sir, Reginald meant no harm, Miss Marple said, but we often fail to consider how our words will be received by those in vulnerable positions. A reference that seems perfectly adequate to the writer may appear quite different to the person whose future depends upon it. Miss Caroline nodded slowly. Mr. Grant didn't send it. That's what troubles father most, I think. That he wrote this careful, correct letter, and Mr. Grant looked at it and decided it wasn't worth sending. What does that tell you about how he must have felt? It tells me, Miss Marple said quietly, that he understood what wasn't being said as clearly as what was, that after 40 years of loyal service he merited only the barest acknowledgement of competence, with no mention of the exceptional trust he'd earned or the personal qualities that had made him valuable beyond his routine duties. But those things couldn't be mentioned without— Caroline stopped again, her face flushing slightly. Without revealing that there were matters requiring discretion, Miss Marple finished gently. Without acknowledging that Mr. Grant's value to your family rested partly on his willingness to know things and remain silent about them, and to mention that in a reference would be to suggest that future employers might also have secrets they wished kept. Miss Caroline's hands clenched, briefly, then relaxed. You make it sound sordid. It wasn't like that. We're not people with dark secrets or scandalous histories, just ordinary family difficulties that are no one else's business. Of course, Miss Marple agreed, but the effect on Mr. Grant's prospects was the same, wasn't it? His discretion, which had made him valuable to your household, became a liability when he sought to move elsewhere. How could your father praise it without implying there were things to be discreet about? And yet without praising it, the reference reduced 40 years of devoted service to mere routine adequacy. They stood in silence for a moment, the morning sun warming the churchyard and the sound of bees humming among the flowers. Miss Caroline seemed to be struggling with something, and when she finally spoke, her voice was subdued. I never liked Mr. Grant particularly. He always seemed rather cold to me, rather judgmental in his reserve, but I'm beginning to think we judged him first, aren't we? We decided what he was worth, and we never reconsidered it, even after 40 years of proving himself. And when he finally needed us to speak well of him, we couldn't manage anything better than adequate and routine. Recognition of that is worth something, Miss Marple said. Is it? He's still dead, and the letter was still never sent, and we still benefited from his service without ever properly valuing it. Miss Caroline gathered up her gardening tools with sharp, angry movements. I should go. I've said far more than I intended, and father would be horrified if he knew I'd discussed family matters with anyone outside the household. She departed with a curt nod, leaving Miss Marple standing among the graves thinking about letters carefully worded to say as little as possible while maintaining the appearance of adequacy, about reputations preserved at the expense of futures foreclosed, about the particular cruelty of praising someone just enough to appear generous while ensuring they could never escape to somewhere better. Mr. Grant had requested a reference, and had received one that was technically correct yet effectively useless. A letter that would tell any prospective employer that here was a man who had served adequately, reliably, routinely, but who apparently possessed no exceptional qualities worth mentioning after 40 years of service. No wonder he had never sent it, and no wonder, Miss Marple thought, that he had remained at Ashley Court, trapped not by loyalty, but by the impossibility of proving his worth to anyone else when his own employer would barely vouch for it. She walked home slowly, the morning's beauty shadowed by the image of a man holding a letter that reduced his life's work to a few carefully neutral sentences, and understanding finally that there would be no escape after all. Chapter 7. The Weight of an Old Obligation. Miss Marple had become acquainted with Dr. Haydock during her years in St. Mary Mead through the ordinary interactions of village life, committee meetings, charitable events, and the occasional medical consultation. He was a sensible man in his early 50s, practical rather than imaginative, with the kind of straightforward manner that inspired confidence without encouraging excessive intimacy. He was not given to gossip, which made it all the more significant when he sought Miss Marple out deliberately at the village fete, clearly wishing to speak with her about a matter of some delicacy. The fete was being held in the grounds of the vicarage, a pleasant affair of modest stalls and gentle entertainment that raised funds for the church roof with the same dependable regularity as the seasons themselves. Miss Marple had been manning the white elephant table for the past hour when Dr. Haydock appeared at her elbow ostensibly to examine a set of leather-bound books that someone had donated. "Tolerable condition," he remarked, turning over one of the volumes, "though I doubt anyone will buy them. People don't seem to read Gibbon anymore." He set down the book and lowered his voice. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might have a word with you, privately if possible." They moved away from the stalls, walking slowly along the vicarage garden path where they could speak without being overheard. Dr. Haydock seemed to be choosing his words with care. "I've been troubled by something," he said finally. "Something to do with Wilfred Grant's death. You were at the funeral, I believe, and I understand you've taken an interest in the circumstances." "Only in the way one does when someone familiar passes away," Miss Marple said mildly. "One naturally wonders about such things." Dr. Haydock nodded. "Yes, quite natural. The thing is, I was Grant's physician, such as it was. He rarely consulted me. Servants of his generation tend to avoid medical attention until matters become serious. But I had examined him perhaps 6 months ago when he developed a persistent cough. His heart was weak, certainly, but not dangerously so. I saw no immediate cause for concern provided he avoided undue strain." "But he died of heart failure," Miss Marple observed. "Yes, he did. And that's not unusual for a man of his age with a weak heart. What troubles me is the timing, and something Sir Reginald said when I came to certify the death." Dr. Haydock paused, watching a group of children playing on the vicarage lawn. He seemed relieved, Miss Marple. Not merely relieved that Grant's suffering was over, that would be natural enough, but relieved in a way that suggested some burden had been lifted. He said something about how Grant had been loyal to the very end and how one couldn't have asked for better discretion. It struck me as an odd thing to say about someone who had just died. Perhaps he was thinking of Mr. Grant's years of service, Miss Marple suggested. Perhaps, but combined with something else I'd observed, it made me wonder. Dr. Haydock glanced around to ensure they remained private. "This goes back many years, Miss Marple, nearly 40 years in fact, to shortly after Grant first entered service at Ashley Court. I was a young physician then, newly established in practice, and I was called to attend to a rather delicate matter at the house." He fell silent for a moment, and Miss Marple waited patiently, sensing that this was a memory he had kept to himself for a long time. Sir Reginald was a young man then, recently married. His father was still alive but in declining health. There was a situation involving a young woman from the village, a housemaid at Ashley Court, in fact. She found herself in difficulties, if you'll understand my meaning. I understand, Miss Marple said quietly. Sir Reginald was not responsible. At least that was the official version, but there were circumstances that suggested his involvement, or at the very least his knowledge of who was responsible. The matter was handled very quietly. The girl was sent away with enough money to see her through her confinement and settled elsewhere. No scandal ensued, and I was led to believe that Grant had been instrumental in managing the whole business, speaking to the girl, making the arrangements, ensuring that nothing became public knowledge. That must have required considerable tact, Miss Marple observed. Indeed. But what struck me at the time was how Grant had positioned himself. He made it clear to me in his quiet way that he knew exactly what had occurred and who bore responsibility, not through threats or demands, you understand, simply through the way he managed the situation, the care he took to protect certain parties while ensuring others were provided for. It was masterfully done, and it left everyone involved in his debt. Dr. Haydock stopped walking and turned to face Miss Marple directly. The thing is, Miss Marple, such debts don't simply disappear. They persist, sometimes for decades, creating a bond between the debtor and the one who holds the obligation. Grant never spoke of it again, as far as I know. He continued his duties as if nothing had happened, but he remained at Ashley Court for 40 years, and one has to wonder whether his loyalty was entirely voluntary, or whether it was maintained by mutual understanding that certain knowledge was safer kept within the household. You're suggesting Mr. Grant stayed because he knew things that Sir Reginald preferred not to have generally known, Miss Marple said. I'm suggesting that obligations work in both directions. Sir Reginald was obliged to keep Grant employed and reasonably comfortable, and Grant was obliged to remain discreet and not seek positions elsewhere where he might, deliberately or accidentally, reveal what he knew. It wasn't blackmail. Nothing so crude as that, simply an understanding between two men who each held something the other needed. Miss Marple considered this carefully. And when Sir Reginald suggested retirement? Precisely. When Sir Reginald suggested retirement, he was effectively ending that understanding. He was saying in effect that Grant's continued silence was no longer worth the cost of his continued employment. Or perhaps he had convinced himself that after 40 years, the obligation had been adequately discharged. Dr. Haydock's expression was grave. But obligations of that sort are never truly discharged, Miss Marple. They simply become part of the fabric of one's life, and when they're suddenly torn away, the results can be devastating. They resumed walking, moving slowly through the garden, as other fete-goers passed them with cheerful greetings. Miss Marple's mind was working through the implications of what Dr. Haydock had revealed. "You think Mr. Grant felt betrayed," she said. "I think Mr. Grant felt used. He had given 40 years of his life to maintaining Sir Reginald's reputation and peace of mind. He had set aside his own prospects, his own possibilities, to remain in a position where he could ensure that certain matters stayed private. And when he was finally told his services were no longer required, he must have realized that all those years had been valued only for their utility, not for any genuine regard or gratitude." "And yet Sir Reginald almost certainly believes he acted correctly," Miss Marple said. "He would tell himself that he had more than compensated Grant through steady employment and fair treatment, that any old obligations had been more than satisfied through years of wages and security." "Exactly so, and he would be quite sincere in that belief." Dr. Haydock shook his head. "That's what makes these situations so tragic. Neither party sees the matter as the other does. Sir Reginald calculated his debt in financial terms, wages paid, security provided, but Grant's sacrifice was measured in years of his life, in opportunities foregone, in a future that could never be reclaimed. How does one calculate the value of that?" Miss Marple was silent for a moment, watching the afternoon sunlight filter through the trees. "One doesn't," she said finally, which is perhaps why Sir Reginald convinced himself the debt had been paid. It's easier than acknowledging that some obligations can never truly be satisfied. "And now Grant is dead," Dr. Haydock said quietly, "and Sir Reginald can tell himself it was simply heart failure, a natural death for a man of his age and condition, which it was, medically speaking, but one wonders what role despair plays in such failures, whether a heart can simply give up when the person it sustains realizes there's nothing left to sustain." They had circled back to the fete, where the afternoon activities were continuing with the same pleasant bustle. Dr. Haydock excused himself to attend to other obligations, leaving Miss Marple to return to her stall, but she found her mind remained occupied with the picture he had painted. Mr. Grant had not simply been a loyal butler who had served the Ashley family faithfully for 40 years. He had been the keeper of secrets, the manager of difficulties, the one who had made it possible for Sir Reginald to maintain his position and reputation without the burden of acknowledged scandal. And he had done this not entirely out of choice, but out of a complex web of obligation and understanding that had bound him to Ashley Court as effectively as any legal contract. The tragedy was that Sir Reginald genuinely believed he had been generous. He had provided steady employment, fair wages, and comfortable accommodation. He had been, by conventional standards, a good employer. What he had failed to recognise was that by accepting Grant's discretion and protection, he had incurred a debt that couldn't be calculated in pounds and shillings, and when he had finally decided that Grant should retire kindly, correctly, with proper notice and offers of assistance, he had been unaware that he was effectively declaring that debt satisfied and closed, that Grant's value to the household had been fully exhausted, his usefulness at an end. Miss Marple thought about debts unacknowledged, obligations that pressed downward over decades until they became part of the very structure of one's life. And she thought about what it must have felt like to Mr. Grant, receiving that letter suggesting retirement, understanding that after 40 years of protecting Sir Reginald's interests above his own, he was being told his services were no longer needed, not with cruelty, not with ingratitude in any obvious sense, simply with the calm assumption that fair employment constituted fair exchange, and that when employment ended, all obligations ended with it. It was, she reflected, a very common mistake, and often, by the time people realised their error, it was far too late to make amends. Chapter 8. When Miss Marple reconsiders a courtesy. Miss Marple had learned over many years of observing human behaviour that the truth of a situation often revealed itself not in dramatic revelations, but through the patient reconsideration of details already known. It was a matter of arranging facts in their proper sequence and attending to the spaces between them, the moments when something might have been said or done but wasn't, the small hesitations that marked where courtesy had replaced genuine feeling. She had been sitting in her cottage on a quiet evening, her knitting progressing steadily, while her mind turned over everything she had learned about Wilfred Grant's final days. The facts themselves were simple enough, even mundane, yet there was something in their arrangement that troubled her, a pattern that suggested more than the sum of its parts. Mr. Grant had received Sir Reginald's letter about retirement. That much was established. Mrs. Ashley had mentioned he had. It and Sir Reginald himself had discussed it with evident discomfort. The letter had been kindly worded, carefully phrased, and delivered perhaps 2 or 3 weeks before Mr. Grant's death. He had responded correctly, thanking Sir Reginald for his consideration and saying he would give the matter thought. Then, more recently, he had requested a reference letter for the agency that placed temporary staff. Sir Reginald had written one, adequate, routine, preserving his own privacy while offering minimal praise. Mr. Grant had looked at that letter and chosen not to send it, which suggested he had understood exactly what it meant. And then had come that final evening. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose to make herself a cup of tea, her movements automatic while her mind remained focused on reconstructing that sequence of events. Mr. Grant had served dinner as usual. Alice had mentioned that specifically. He had performed his duties with his customary precision, giving no sign of distress or illness. Dinner had concluded and the family had dispersed to their evening occupations. Sir Reginald had retired to his study to work on some papers. Mr. Grant had prepared the usual supper tray, cold meat, cheese, bread, exactly as he had done countless times over 40 years. He had brought it to the study, and here was where the pattern shifted. Instead of waiting to see if anything else was required, instead of ensuring Sir Reginald was comfortable and needed no further service, Mr. Grant had been told to leave the tray and not return that evening. Miss Marple carried her tea back to her chair and sat down again, her eyes thoughtful. Why had Sir Reginald given that instruction? It wasn't his usual practice. Mrs. Pemberton had made that clear. The routine was established, predictable, unchanged over years. So something that evening had been different. The most likely explanation, Miss Marple reflected, was that Sir Reginald had needed to speak with Mr. Grant about something uncomfortable, and having spoken, had wished to be left alone. The retirement letter had been sent weeks ago. The reference had been written and presumably delivered to Mr. Grant some days before. What else might have required discussion? She rose again and went to her small writing desk, extracting a piece of paper on which she began to note down the sequence of events as she understood them. The physical act of writing often helped her see connections more clearly. Mr. Grant receives retirement letter, thanks Sir Reginald, says he will consider, requests reference for the temporary position, receives inadequate reference, does not send reference, final evening, serves dinner, prepares supper tray, told to leave and not return, goes to his room, dies that night. Miss Marple studied what she had written, and a possibility began to emerge that she had not previously considered. What if the conversation that evening had not been about the retirement or the reference at all? What if Sir Reginald, having given Mr. Grant time to consider his suggestion, had asked for a decision? She could imagine the scene quite clearly. Sir Reginald working in his study, waiting for the supper tray to arrive, Mr. Grant bringing it with his usual precision, Sir Reginald perhaps feeling that enough time had elapsed, asking pleasantly whether Mr. Grant had reached any conclusion about retirement, expecting possibly that Mr. Grant would agree that it was time, that the arrangement would be managed smoothly and correctly, and Mr. Grant, what would Mr. Grant have said? Miss Marple set down her pen and gazed out the window at the darkening evening. If Dr. Haydock was correct about the old obligation, then Mr. Grant had spent 40 years protecting Sir Reginald's reputation, maintaining discretion, ensuring that certain matters remained private. He had sacrificed his own prospects, his education, his possibilities for a different life, and now he was being asked to agree that this had all been fairly compensated by wages and security, that it was time to move on and make way for someone new. Perhaps he has tried to explain. Perhaps he had suggested, with his usual discretion, that he had given rather more than routine service. That there were considerations beyond the usual employer-employee relationship. Nothing improper, nothing that could be called blackmail, simply an acknowledgement of what they both knew to be true. And Sir Reginald, uncomfortable with such acknowledgement, might have responded with the automatic courtesy of his class. "Thank you, Grant, that will be all. Please leave the tray and don't trouble yourself to return this evening. I can manage perfectly well on my own." It would have been said kindly. Sir Reginald would have meant it kindly. But to Mr. Grant, after 40 years of service built on mutual understanding, those words would have carried a devastating finality. They would have meant, your usefulness is concluded, your knowledge no longer commands consideration, your sacrifice is neither recognised nor valued. Miss Marple found herself remembering something her own mother had once said about servants in the old days. They hear everything and see everything, her mother had observed. And we pretend they hear nothing and see nothing. It's a necessary fiction, but it requires both parties to maintain it. When that fiction breaks down, the relationship becomes impossible. Perhaps that was what had happened that evening. Mr. Grant, facing the end of his employment and the inadequacy of his reference, had tried to break through the fiction. And Sir Reginald, either through genuine lack of understanding or through deliberate refusal to acknowledge what was being implied, had responded by reinforcing it. By telling Mr. Grant to leave, he had been telling him to return to his proper place, invisible, unacknowledged, convenient. The next morning, Dorothy had found him in his chair, dressed for evening service, having died sometime during the night. Dr. Haydock had confirmed that stress could precipitate heart failure in someone with Mr. Grant's condition. The body, Miss Marple thought, had its own wisdom. Sometimes it simply stopped when it understood there was no longer any reason to continue. She rose the following morning with a sense of clarity about what had occurred, though proving it or even articulating it properly would be quite another matter. She had no evidence beyond circumstantial details and her own understanding of human nature. But she was now certain of the essential truth. Mr. Grant had not merely died of heart failure. He had died of being dismissed, not with cruelty, not with obvious unkindness, but with the calm, courteous finality of someone no longer necessary. That afternoon, she decided to call once more at Ashley Court, not to accuse or confront, but to ensure that Sir Reginald understood what had truly happened. Sometimes Miss Marple believed people needed to be shown what they had done before they could begin to reckon with it properly. She found Sir Reginald in the library, a room she had rarely entered before. He received her with his usual courtesy, though she detected a wariness in his manner that suggested he suspected she had not come merely for a social call. "Sir Reginald," she began after the preliminary pleasantries had been observed, "I wonder if I might ask you about that last evening with Mr. Grant. I don't mean to intrude on private matters, but I believe it's important." His expression tightened slightly. "What about it?" "Did you speak with him that evening? Beyond the usual household interactions, I mean. Did you have a conversation about his future?" There was a long pause before Sir Reginald answered. "I asked whether he had reached a decision about retirement. It seemed reasonable to inquire, given that some weeks had passed since my letter." Sir Reginald, hesitated. He said something about having served the family in various capacities, about certain obligations that existed between us. I didn't quite understand what he meant. It seemed inappropriate somehow to be discussing obligations when I was trying to arrange matters for his benefit. "What did you say to him?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I thanked him for his service and told him we could discuss the details another time. I asked him to leave the supper tray and said I wouldn't need anything else that evening. I thought—" his voice faltered slightly. "I thought I was being considerate, giving him time to compose himself if he was feeling emotional about leaving." "But he wasn't feeling emotional about leaving," Miss Marple said. "He was trying to tell you that leaving was impossible because of obligations you had both understood for 40 years. And when you told him to leave the tray and not return, you were telling him that those obligations no longer existed, that his understanding of the relationship had been mistaken all along." Sir Reginald stared at her, the colour draining from his face. "I never meant, that is, I didn't intend—" "I know you didn't," Miss Marple said quietly, "but the effect was the same. You told him, with perfect courtesy, that he had misunderstood the nature of his service and your obligation to him, and he went to his room and died because there was nothing left to live for." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Miss Marple let it extend, understanding that Sir Reginald needed time to absorb what she had said. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What should I have done?" "You should have listened," Miss Marple said. "You should have acknowledged what he was trying to tell you, even if it made you uncomfortable. You should have recognized that courtesy, when it's used to avoid genuine understanding, becomes a form of cruelty." She rose to take her leave, and Sir Reginald did not try to stop her. As she walked home through the late afternoon, Miss Marple reflected that she had done what she could. Whether it would make any difference was another question entirely. Chapter 9. The Usefulness of Being Forgotten. It was 3 days after Miss Marple's conversation with Sir Reginald that he appeared at her cottage door, unannounced, and without the formality that usually accompanied his movements through the village. He stood on her doorstep with his hat in his hands, looking older than she remembered, and somewhat uncertain, as though he had forgotten the proper form for what he wished to say. Miss Marple, I apologise for calling without notice. I wonder if you might spare me a few moments." She admitted him to her small sitting room, noting the careful way he settled himself in the chair she indicated, as though he were a visitor in unfamiliar territory, rather than a man accustomed to being received with deference. She poured tea without asking whether he wished it, understanding that the familiar ritual might ease what was clearly a difficult errand. "I have not been sleeping well," he began, accepting the cup she offered. "I find myself returning again and again to what you said about Grant, about how my courtesy became a form of—" He paused, unable or unwilling to repeat the word she had used. "A form of cruelty," Miss Marple supplied gently. "Yes, I remember saying that. I have been trying to understand it, how something done with the best of intentions could produce such a result. I meant to be kind, Miss Marple, I truly did. The letter about retirement was intended to ease his burden, not to increase it. The reference was meant to help him find lighter work, not to trap him. And that evening, when I asked him to leave, I thought I was being considerate of his feelings." "I'm certain you did think so," Miss Marple said. Sir Reginald set down his cup with a slight tremor in his hand. "But you suggested that I had failed to listen, that Grant was trying to tell me something important, and I dismissed it out of convenience or discomfort. I've been attempting to recall exactly what he said that evening, but I'm ashamed to admit I wasn't paying close attention. I was tired, I had papers to review, and I rather wished the conversation hadn't happened at all." "That's very honest of you," Miss Marple observed. "He spoke about obligations," Sir Reginald continued, his voice strained. "About having served the family in ways that went beyond the ordinary duties of his position. I think he mentioned, some matter from long ago that he had managed discreetly, and He stopped, his face flushing slightly. "I pretended not to understand, or perhaps I genuinely didn't wish to understand. I thanked him for his loyalty and suggested we could discuss particulars at a later time." "Thereby indicating that you saw no need for any particular discussion at all," Miss Marple said quietly. "Exactly." Sir Reginald's shoulders sagged. "I see it now, though I didn't then. By refusing to acknowledge what he was saying, by treating it as something that could be postponed or dismissed, I was telling him that his understanding of our relationship was mistaken, that whatever he believed existed between us was simply his own misapprehension." Miss Marple poured more tea, allowing him time to continue at his own pace. Sir Reginald stared into his cup as though seeking answers in its depths. "The thing is, Miss Marple, he wasn't wrong. There was an obligation. Money. Dr. Haydock came to see me yesterday. He said you had spoken and that I should know the full truth of what Grant had done for my family all those years ago. The matter with the housemaid, the arrangements he made, the discretion he maintained. I had convinced myself over the years that it was simply part of his duties, that I had compensated him adequately through steady employment. But when Haydock laid it out so plainly, I couldn't maintain that fiction any longer. Fictions of that sort often persist only so long as all parties agree to maintain them," Miss Marple said. "When one party attempts to acknowledge the truth, the fiction collapses. And Grant attempted to acknowledge it that evening, didn't he? He tried to make me see that my obligation to him couldn't be satisfied simply by offering a pension and a cottage, that he had given me something I couldn't repay, his sins and his protection, his willingness to remain invisible so that I could be visible." Sir Reginald's voice broke slightly, and I responded by telling him to leave the tray and not trouble me further, as if he were any ordinary servant making improper claims. "You responded as you had been taught to respond," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "Your class and position have certain customs about how such matters are to be handled. You followed those customs precisely. The difficulty is that customs are designed to maintain existing arrangements, not to acknowledge uncomfortable truths." Sir Reginald looked up at her, his expression anguished. "But that makes it worse, doesn't it? If I had been deliberately cruel, that would at least suggest some recognition of what I was doing. But I wasn't even aware of causing harm. I thought I was behaving correctly, following the proper forms, and all the while I was destroying a man without even noticing I was doing it. That is often how the most damage is done, Miss Marple agreed. Not through malice, but through the comfortable assumption that propriety equals kindness. They sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon light slanting through the window and illuminating the simple furnishings of Miss Marple's sitting room. When Sir Reginald spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Grant dying of being made unnecessary without being seen. It's a remarkable phrase, and I believe it captures exactly what occurred. For 40 years he was necessary to me, not simply as a butler, but as the keeper of knowledge I preferred not to acknowledge, as the guardian of reputation, the manager of difficulties, the one who made it possible for me to maintain my position without confronting certain uncomfortable truths about how that position had been preserved." "Yes," Miss Marple said simply. "And when I suggested retirement, I was effectively declaring him unnecessary. I had convinced myself that enough time had passed, that old matters were safely buried, that his usefulness had ended. But more than that—" Sir Reginald paused, searching for words. "More than that, I failed to see him at all. I saw only his function, his role. When that role became inconvenient or uncomfortable, I removed it, and I never once considered that there was a person behind that role, someone who had shaped his entire life around being necessary to me." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That's very perceptive, Sir Reginald, and very painful, I should imagine." "It is." He set down his cup and leaned forward slightly. "The question I cannot answer is what I should do now. Grant is dead. I cannot apologize to him or make amends, and yet I feel I must do something, must acknowledge somehow that his death was not simply a medical event, but the result of choices I made, blindnesses I cultivated." "There are no easy answers to that question," Miss Marple said, "though I would suggest that the acknowledgement itself is important. Not public acknowledgement necessarily. That would perhaps serve your need for absolution more than any real purpose. But private recognition of what occurred, and a determination not to make similar mistakes in the future." Sir Reginald absorbed this, then asked quietly, "Do you think others have guessed? My wife, Caroline, the servants?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that people are beginning to understand that Mr. Grant's death was more complicated than it first appeared. Whether they will draw the same conclusions I have drawn is another matter. But I believe several people at Ashley Court are reconsidering their own roles in what happened. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned to me that she regrets not having noticed Grant was struggling. Miss Caroline spoke of how the family judged him without ever reconsidering that judgment. Even Alice seems troubled by the atmosphere in the house during those final days." "So I am not alone in my guilt," Sir Reginald said, though without apparent comfort. "Guilt is rarely solitary," Miss Marple observed. "Most harm is collaborative, even when those involved don't recognise their participation. But that doesn't diminish your particular responsibility. You were the one with power in the relationship. You were the one who made the ultimate decisions about Grant's employment and future. The others may have contributed to an atmosphere that made him feel invisible, but you were the one who told him he was unnecessary." Sir Reginald rose, moving to the window and looking out at the quiet village street. "I keep thinking about that tray left outside my study, the untouched food, the care he'd taken in its preparation, the fact that he never came back for it. It was such a small thing, and yet it contained everything: his decades of service, my casual dismissal, the end of whatever understanding had existed between us." "Small things often do contain everything," Miss Marple said. "That's why they're worth attending to." He turned back to face her, his expression showing both gratitude and continued distress. "Thank you for speaking so frankly with me, Miss Marple. I am not accustomed to being criticised, and it has not been comfortable. But I recognise that you have done me a service by refusing to allow me to maintain comfortable fictions about what occurred." "I have only told you what I observed," Miss Marple said. "What you do with that knowledge is your own affair." After Sir Reginald had taken his leave, Miss Marple returned to her chair and her knitting, her needles moving with their customary rhythm While her mind turned over the conversation, she believed Sir Reginald's distress was genuine, his recognition of his failure sincere. Whether that recognition would produce any lasting change in his behaviour or understanding was less certain. People who had lived their entire lives within certain assumptions about class and obligation rarely managed to step outside those assumptions completely, even when they glimpsed the damage they caused. But perhaps, Miss Marple thought, sincere discomfort was itself valuable. Perhaps the best she could hope for was that Sir Reginald would carry some awareness of what had happened, some understanding that courtesy and custom were not always synonymous with kindness, and that people whose usefulness ended were still people deserving of recognition and regard, and it was not much, but it was something. And sometimes, in the complicated business of human relations, something was all one could reasonably expect. She picked up her tea, which had grown cool while Sir Reginald spoke, and reflected that she had done what she could. The rest, as with so many things, would have to take care of itself. Chapter 10. After the bell was finally silent. The memorial plaque was installed on a mild morning in early June, mounted discreetly on the wall of the servants' corridor at Ashley Court, where it would be seen primarily by those who worked there. It was made of polished brass, modest in size, and bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Wilfred Grant, who served this household faithfully from 1885 to 1925. His dedication will not be forgotten." Sir Reginald had consulted Miss Marple about the wording, appearing at her cottage one afternoon with several drafts and an air of anxious uncertainty quite unlike his usual manner. She had suggested removing the phrase "loyal and discreet," which had appeared in his first version, explaining gently that such qualities, while true, carried implications that might be better left unstated. He had agreed with visible relief, as though grateful to have someone guide him through territory he found increasingly difficult to navigate. The household staff had been gathered for a brief ceremony when the plaque was unveiled. Sir Reginald had spoken a few words, simple, direct, and notably free of the comfortable platitudes that had marked his speech at the funeral. He had acknowledged that Mr. Grant's service had been undervalued during his lifetime, that the household had failed to recognise adequately what he had contributed, and that this memorial, while insufficient, represented a commitment to remember more honestly. Mrs. Pemberton had told Miss Marple about it later, over tea at the cottage. It was very affecting, Miss Marple. Sir Reginald seemed quite moved, and he spoke so differently from his usual way, less formal, if you understand me, as though he were speaking to people rather than delivering remarks. She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "The household feels different now. I can't quite explain it, but there's been a change in how we all go about things. More awareness, perhaps, of each other as people, rather than simply as roles to be filled." Miss Marple had nodded, pleased but not surprised. Sometimes acknowledgement of harm, even when it came too late to help those most affected, could alter the atmosphere of a place in subtle but meaningful ways. Life at Ashley Court had indeed resumed its routines, though not without alteration. A new butler had been engaged, a younger man from London with excellent credentials but without Mr. Grant's history with the family. Sir Reginald had been careful this time to establish clear expectations about hours, duties, and time off, and had even suggested that the new man, Mr. Davies, might wish to pursue his own interests and maintain his own life outside the household. Mr. Davies had accepted these terms with some surprise, being more accustomed to the traditional expectation that a butler's entire existence would be absorbed into service. Miss Caroline had surprised everyone, including perhaps herself, by taking a more active interest in household management. She had begun meeting weekly with Mrs. Pemberton to review accounts and discuss staff concerns, and had even instituted a small fund for medical expenses and emergencies that would be available to all household employees. When Miss Marple had mentioned hearing about this innovation, Miss Caroline had flushed slightly and said, "It seems only practical. One shouldn't wait until people are desperate before offering assistance." Mrs. Ashley had been the slowest to adjust, finding the changes in household atmosphere somewhat unsettling. She had expressed to Miss Marple during a chance encounter at the draper's shop that she found the new butler rather too familiar in his manner, though she immediately qualified this by saying that he was perfectly respectful and did his work well. "It's simply that one isn't accustomed to staff who seem to have opinions," she said with a small, uncertain smile. "Mr. Grant never offered opinions. Perhaps," Miss Marple had suggested Mr. Grant learned that having opinions was not encouraged. Mr. Davies may feel differently, having been assured from the beginning that his thoughts are valued. Mrs. Ashley had considered this with visible effort, then nodded slowly. "I suppose that's possible. One does tend to assume that silence means contentment, doesn't one? When it might mean something quite different." The village had absorbed Mr. Grant's death with the quiet acceptance typical of communities where death was a familiar visitor, neither shocking nor particularly remarkable. The circumstances remained private. No scandal had erupted, no dramatic revelations had disturbed the surface of village life. But among those who had known the details, or guessed at them, there had been a subtle shift in how certain matters were discussed. Miss Fortescue had mentioned to Miss Marple that she had been thinking about her father's efforts to encourage young Wilfred Grant all those years ago, and wondering whether more might have been done to preserve those possibilities. "Though I suppose," she had added, "life presents us all with choices that foreclose other choices. One can't live every path simultaneously." "No," Miss Marple had agreed, "but one can acknowledge what was sacrificed when particular paths were chosen or imposed. Recognition doesn't change the past, but it changes how we understand it." On a warm afternoon in mid-June, Miss Marple sat in her garden with her knitting, enjoying the pleasant sounds of summer, birds calling, bees working among her roses, the distant voices of children playing. Her mind turned, as it often did during such peaceful moments, to the matter of Wilfred Grant and what his life had meant. He had not been murdered in any conventional sense. No one had struck him or poisoned him or arranged some fatal accident. Yet he had died before his time nonetheless, killed by the accumulated weight of being unseen, unvalued, and finally dismissed as unnecessary. It was a quieter sort of violence than usually commanded attention, but violence nonetheless, the violence of erasure, of reduction, of treating a person as merely a function that could be discontinued when it became inconvenient. She thought about service, that ancient arrangement whereby some people devoted their lives to enabling the comfort and dignity of others. In its best form, it could be a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and fair exchange. But too often, particularly in households like Ashley Court, it became something else. A relationship where one party's full humanity was quietly set aside for the convenience of the other, where courtesy masked fundamental inequality, and where loyalty was demanded without being reciprocated. Mr. Grant had served faithfully for 40 years. He had set aside his own prospects, maintained silence about matters that might have damaged his employer, and performed his duties with a precision that had made him seem almost invisible. And in return he had been told, when he was no longer useful, that his services could be dispensed with, that he could be replaced, that his understanding of what existed between himself and the family had been mistaken. No accusation had been made publicly, and none would be. Sir Reginald had not violated any law or even any clearly articulated moral principle. He had simply done what people of his class had always done, managed his household according to his own convenience, dismissed staff when he chose, and assumed that proper compensation absolved him of deeper obligation. But Miss Marple, who had spent many years observing human behaviour and its consequences, understood that the absence of scandal did not mean the absence of wrong. Some harms were too subtle, too thoroughly woven into the fabric of everyday life, to be addressed through public censure or legal remedy. They could only be recognised privately, acknowledged quietly, and perhaps, if one were fortunate, prevented from recurring in quite the same way. She wondered whether Sir Reginald's recognition of what had happened would persist, or whether time and the pressures of maintaining his position would gradually erode his uncomfortable awareness. She hoped for the former, but suspected the latter was more likely. People who benefited from existing arrangements rarely maintained sustained consciousness of their costs to others. Still, The memorial plaque existed. The household operated somewhat differently. Small changes had been made in how staff were treated and regarded. It wasn't justice. Mr. Bipser Grant could not be restored to life or given back the years he had spent in service rather than in pursuit of his own possibilities. But it was acknowledgement, which was more than often survived such situations. Miss Marple finished the row she had been knitting and set her work aside. She rose and went inside to prepare her tea, moving through her cottage with the ease of long familiarity. When the tea was ready, she carried it back to the garden and settled once more in her chair. She reached for the small brass bell that sat on the table beside her, a pretty thing given to her years ago by a grateful nephew. She rang it gently, more out of habit than need, and waited. Her housemaid, young Susan, appeared from the kitchen with a questioning expression. "Did you need something, Miss Marple?" "No, my dear, thank you. I was simply wool gathering and rang without thinking. How are you getting on with your afternoon?" Susan smiled, pleased to be asked. "Very well. Thank you, Miss Marple. I've nearly finished the ironing, and then I thought I'd start on tomorrow's baking if you've no objection." "No objection at all. You manage things beautifully." Miss Marple paused, then added, "I hope you know, Susan, that I value your work and your presence here. You're not simply someone who performs tasks. You're a person with your own thoughts and interests, and I'm glad to have you in my household." Susan looked surprised and rather touched. "Thank you, Miss Marple. That's very kind of you to say." After Susan had returned to her work, Miss Marple sat quietly, sipping her tea and reflecting that small courtesies, genuine recognition, and sincere appreciation cost nothing but attention. They were not difficult to offer, provided one remembered that the people who served were, in fact, people. Complete and complex,